Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our new two classes that we're going to be doing. So the idea is that every Sunday we're going to be studying at this time, and the idea is to also have something which is connected to the concept of Moshiach. So for the next 2 weeks, which means today and next Sunday, we are going to be talking about the life and legacy of King David, which is really a fascinating life story, as I'm sure many of you already know, with particular emphasis on his relationship to the concept of Moshiach. So first, a little bit about King David. King David himself was born in the Jewish year 2854. Just to give you a little bit of context, the Jewish people left Egypt in the year 2448. They were in the desert, obviously, for 40 years. And King David is born in the year 2854. If you want the Goyish year, we have King David is born in the year 907 BCE. And we left Egypt in the year 1313 BCE. So we're talking about approximately somewhere, 400 and something, 500 years. So the Jewish people are in the desert, obviously under the leadership of Joshua. They enter the land of Israel. They're there for something like 400 or so years. And that's when the first appointment of a king took place. The first king for the Jewish people was actually King Saul. And after that, of course, was King David. So King David was actually the second king of Israel, but he was the first king from the tribe of Judah. So he's the second king of the Jewish people. He ruled for 40 years. He lived for 70 years. And we have a fascinating midrash that tells us that when God created Adam, Adam was given insight or access, if you will, to look at all the souls that would be born later on, throughout history. So Adam is kind of the first, what's it called, those dating apps, Adam is over there just kind of swiping through like, this is a nice one. Let's see what's going to happen to him. Rabbi Kesselman, Dr. Schultz, just kind of swiping through. And he came across the soul of King David. And when Adam looked at the soul, he saw that it was destined just to live a few hours or a few days. It wasn't going to live very long. And Adam saw that the soul was such a strong and shining soul. So he asked Hashem, what's happening over here? So God told him that for whatever reason it was, the soul was destined to come into the world for not very long. So Adam gave of his life 70 years to the soul, which was later on the soul of King David. And it's interesting that Adam died at 930 years old. So what would have been 1,000 became 930. And King David lived 70 years. We are told that he was born and passed away on the holiday of Atzeret. Atzeret is Shavuot, which is what we're celebrating next week, which is the real reason why I decided to talk about King David, because his birthday and his Yortzeit is on Shavuot, which we're celebrating next week. Reasons why we read the book of Ruth on the holiday of Shavuot, because as we are going to see in a couple minutes in greater detail, King David is a descendant of Ruth, and therefore on Shavuot we read the book of Ruth. There are many other reasons given as to why we read the book of Ruth, but this is one idea connected to that. So King David, as I mentioned before, has a very strong connection to Moshiach. Number one, we are told, the Rambam tells us clearly that Moshiach, whoever it's going to be, has to be a direct descendant, father, son, father, son, father, son, father, son, from King David himself. But much more than that, the Rambam, when describing, what Moshiach is going to do, the Rambam says as follows, and I'll pull it up for you so you can follow along with me. The Rambam says as follows: in the future, the messianic king will arise and renew the Davidic dynasty, restoring it to its initial sovereignty. He will build a temple and gather the dispersed of Israel. So the Rambam tells us that Moshiach is really coming to restore, if you will, and bring back the Davidic dynasty, to the point that the Rambam goes on at quite great length. As you'll see over here, the Rambam says that where in the Torah, in the written Torah, in the Torah Shebechtav, do we find a reference to King David? So he says it comes from the prophecies of Bilam. So I'm sure you're familiar with the section in the Torah where there was a king called Balak who hired a prophet called Bilam to curse the Jewish people. And instead of landed up cursing the Jewish people, he lands up blessing them. And in those verses, it's full of prophecies which refer to Moshiach. So he says in the verse, Bilam, and this is recorded in the Torah, it says, I see it, but not now. I perceive it, but not in the future, but not in the near future. And the commentaries explain that that's half the verse is talking about David, and half the verse is referring to Moshiach. And same thing with the second verse. Half the verse is referring to David, and half the verse is referring to Moshiach. Same thing, the third verse, half the verse, and the fourth one, etc. So over and over again, you see this concept that the prophecy that talks about Moshiach, the same exact prophecy, the same verse is prophesizing half about King David and half about Moshiach himself. And King David, the Rambam tells us, is called the first Moshiach. He is Moshiach Harishon. And the Moshiach that we are waiting for is the last Moshiach, the Moshiach HaAcharon. So the idea of King David's connection to Moshiach is not just the fact that he's the ancestor, if you will, of Moshiach, but he himself is called Moshiach. And what Moshiach comes to do is to return the world basically to a Davidic, to the Davidic dynasty. And there's a very fascinating talk that the Rebbe gives about that law that I just showed you from the Rambam. And the Rebbe explains as follows, that on a very simple level, Moshiach, his main job is to bring us, the Jewish people and the world, to a place where we are able to fulfill Torah in its entirety. That's, when somebody says, what's Moshiach? So yes, there'll be miracles and resurrection of the dead, all of that. But the bread and butter, the basic concept of Moshiach is to bring the world back to how it was in the times of King David and enable everyone to be able to fulfill the Torah in its completion. So without a temple, without being in the land of Israel, with all of the limitations that we have, there's so much more than half of the Torah we can't do. So King David was really the first one to be able to do that. Practically, we know that he was not the one that built the temple, as perhaps we'll talk to a little bit more as we go through his life story. He was not the one that practically built a temple, but he set the stage to be able to build a temple. He created a country which was safe. He created the platform. He created the plans. So it was his son, King Solomon, which actually built the temple, which practically made all the Jewish people able to fulfill all the mitzvahs. But King David really gets the credit because it was during his reign that he kind of solidified everything, and he created the ideal situation for how a Jew should live, or how the Jewish people should live, was created by King David through him being king. So let's just talk a little bit about some more of these things, and we'll understand a little bit better who he is and what he did. So we find in the book of Shmuel an interesting story that the first king who was anointed, King Saul, kind of messed up. He did not destroy Amalek the way God had told him to destroy Amalek. And God came to the prophet Samuel, and said, I want you to go and anoint. And when we say anoint, we mean literally pour oil on the head. That's how you were appointed as a king. I want you to go and anoint a new king. So Saul was still alive, and the plan was that he would continue living and live out the rest of his reign, but it would not go to his child. And for all practical purposes, Hashem was already on to the next king, somebody else. So God told the prophet Shmuel, I want you to go to Yishai, who in English they call Yishai Jesse, and you're going to anoint one of Yishai's sons, one of Jesse's sons, to be the next king. Yishai at that point was a very prominent figure amongst the Jewish people. It wasn't like he was a nobody. He was a very important person. And one of his sons is going to be the king. Shmuel says, I don't want to go because Saul is going to get angry at me and he's going to kill me. God makes a plan with him. He takes his special horn of oil and he goes over to Yishai's house. And when he comes, he sees Yishai's oldest son, who's strong, and he has this way about him, has this charisma. And the prophet Samuel says, for sure, this is going to be the one. And he comes to David and he says, gather all your sons, and all the sons gather. And he starts to try and pour the oil on the first son, and none of the oil comes out. He obviously realizes that God doesn't want that one to be the king. And so he goes through all of Yishai's sons, and the oil doesn't come out for any of them. So the prophet turns to Yishai and says, perhaps there's another son that's not here. I told you to bring all your sons, and I think there was 6 or 7 in front of him, but is there somebody else that's not here? So Yishai says, yeah, I have one more son who's tending to the sheep. He's not over here. And the prophet says, bring him here. He comes, and that's King David. The book of Samuel describes him as being, good looking, but he's described as being red-headed. It's interesting just how the prophet kind of picks up on the way that he looked. Long story short, he anoints him with the oil, and of course the oil comes out, and that son, King David, is now anointed as king. But what's interesting is why did Yishai, Jesse, not bring King David to begin with? Amongst all of the other sons, why was he outcasted? And if we look in a number of different places, King David complains that his brothers hated him. He was never part of the family. And there's an interesting backstory to this, why King David was kind of shunned, which I'm sure many of you have heard, but we'll go over it again anyway. And the story starts with Ruth herself. So Ruth herself was a Moabite woman, and her and her mother-in-law Naomi, just very briefly, they land up coming back to Israel, and Ruth marries a man called Boaz, who was a prominent Jewish figure as well. Interestingly enough, they marry, and Boaz dies very soon afterwards, and she's pregnant from Boaz, and she gives birth to a child whose name, by the way, was Oved. And the problem, if you will, surrounding this whole conversation is that the Torah clearly says that a Jewish person may not marry somebody from Moab. We are forbidden from marrying a Moabite person. And there's a teaching from the sages that it only refers to a Moabite male and not a Moabite female. So again, in the written Torah, it says you may not marry a person from Moab. But the rabbis, through their interpretation, through the oral Torah, which we received as a tradition, understood this to be only a Moabite man and not a Moabite woman. However, because the literal text says you may not marry a person from Moab, and it's just the oral Torah that tells us, because of the wording, that it's a Moabite man and not a Moabite woman, there was some controversy and some skepticism which kind of surrounded this law. So you have Ruth, a Moabite woman, marries Boaz, a very prominent Jewish man. They have a child called Oved, and he's considered 100% legitimate. There's nothing wrong with him. Although his mother was Moabite, that's fine because it was a Moabite woman. Oved, then gives birth to a son called Yishai. Yishai is King David's father. And Yishai marries more than one woman, but who we need to talk about is he marries a woman called Nitzevet. That was her name. And they have a bunch of children, some sons, and they have a bunch of children. And at some point, Yishai, who was a very righteous man, the Talmud tells us that he was extremely, extremely great, he decides that it's inappropriate for him to continue living with a Jewish woman because his own status is questionable. Why is his own status questionable? Because his grandmother is a Moabite woman. And although the general consensus was that if it's a Moabite woman, it's not a problem, he decides that his status is questionable, and therefore he may not live anymore with a Jewish woman. He can only live with a convert or a concubine, different ways of getting around this problem of who he is. So he tells his wife, he says, Nitzevet, I love you, honey, and we've had a wonderful run together, and we have a whole bunch of children together, but I'm worried about my status. I know the whole story, but I'm a grandson of a Moabite woman. I cannot live with you anymore, and I cannot have any more children with you. Nitzevet listens to this, and she is not really on the same page as him. She, with her divine inspiration, if you will, knows prophetically or divinely inspired that there's still more important children that have to come from them. And she devises a plan with one of Yishai's, one of her husband's concubines, which he still plans on being intimate with, that when it comes time for intimacy, they're going to make a little switcheroo. And, I don't know exactly how that works, but when the lights are off, whatever it is, Nitzevet is getting in that bed and the concubine is getting out of there. And she is going to do what she has to get pregnant again from her husband, Yishai. Long story short, they do that. And after a couple of months, Mazel Tov, Nitzevet is pregnant. The problem is, how can Nitzevet be pregnant? Because we know that Yishai, her husband, refuses to have any children with her. So she can't be pregnant from her husband. And if you're not pregnant from your husband, you're pregnant from somebody else, but you're a married woman, which in turn makes the child a mamzer. In English, we call that a bastard, right? Which means an illegitimate child. So she carries this pregnancy through. She gives birth to a child who is none other than King David. But from his birth, he was shunned from his family because he was viewed as an illegitimate child, with everyone thinking that his mother, a married woman, became pregnant from another man. So that is the entrance into the world which King David receives. And that's why you're going to see in the book of Tehillim that King David describes him being shunned by all of his brothers, which perhaps also explains why Yishai, his father, brought all the other sons to the prophet Samuel. But King David, he was in the fields, he was being a shepherd, and he wasn't even an option because he was to begin with viewed as an illegitimate child. Who is it? So that gives you a little bit of an insight into how King David, was viewed, or his little entrance into the world. And it's kind of interesting because you have this relationship between Yishai and Nitzevet, King David's mother and father, which, the father didn't know what was happening, the mother did, but that's already one interesting story. You have his grandmother being Ruth, who is a Moabite woman. And if you go further back in time, you're going to see two other strange relationships in the Davidic dynasty. One from his father's, one from the tribe of Judah, and one from Moab, the Moabite tribe itself, where they come from. And we'll start with that one. So all of you are familiar with the biblical story of Lot and his wife returned to a pillar of salt. and the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And Lot ran away. Who was with Lot when they ran away? Speak up if you know the answer.
His daughters.
Right? Lot ran away with 2 daughters. And the Torah, the Bible tells us the story that they're there and they look back and they see the whole thing in flames. And the daughters say to each other, the entire world has been destroyed. We don't know how we are going to repopulate. They got their father drunk. One night, one sister was intimate with her father. The other night, the next sister was intimate with her father. And they gave birth to children who were both born through, what's the English word? Incest. And one of the children was named Ammon, and the other one of the children was named Moab, which the Torah tells us Moab was the daughter's name of saying that this child is Me'ab, he's from my father. So his name in of itself talks to being somebody which is created from a forbidden relation. And this man Moab, who was born from Lot's daughter and Lot himself, is the father of the Moabite nation from which Ruth eventually came. So that's on one side. On the other side, we know that Judah himself, one of the 12 tribes, who is the ancestor of King David. King David is from the tribe of Judah. We know that he also has a strange story in the Torah where he takes a wife for his oldest son, and his oldest son, the Torah tells us, did not find favor in Hashem's eyes. So God took his life. The same woman was then passed as a wife to the next son. Same story happened. And then there was one more son, but he was very young. So they were waiting. In the meantime, this woman whose name was Tamar recognized, similar to King David's mother, Nitzevet, that something has to happen over here. So she dressed up. She went to wait at the crossroads dressed as a harlot, says the Torah. I'm not making up these stories. I'm just telling you biblical stories. That's all I'm doing. And Yehuda landed up being intimate with his daughter-in-law, Tamar, and she gave birth to twins. One was called Peretz and one was called Zorach. And these are the ancestors of King David and the ancestors of Moshiach. So
Boaz was in that line.
Right? Boaz is a direct descendant, father, son, from, I don't remember if it's from Peretz or Zorach, but from one of those 2 children. Sorry? Peretz. Oh, yeah, you're right. So I have the notes in front of me. Thank you. It's directly from Peretz. Just if you are curious, we have Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Yehuda of the 12 tribes, together with this woman Tamar, and they had 2 children, one called Peretz, one called Zerach. So from the son Peretz had a son called Chetzron. Chetzron had a son called Ram. Ram had a son called Aminadav, who we know of from the Torah as well. Aminadav had a son called Nachshon, where we know of Nachshon ben Aminadav. Nachshon had a son called Shalmon. Shalmon had a son called Boaz, who married Ruth. Boaz had a son called Oved. Oved had a son called Yishai, who married Nitzevet, who then had David. And David himself, who is the ancestor of Moshiach, is the ancestor of Moshiach specifically through the line of King Solomon. And his own relationship with the mother of King Solomon was a complicated relationship because he married Bathsheba and had King Solomon. So it's basically sprinkled with all of these complications and interesting things, which one would think, if this is the king, David Melech Israel Chai V'Kayam, right? David, the king of Israel, lives forever, which doesn't mean that he's literally alive, but the spirit of King David lives on forever. The kings are going to continue coming from him. Moshiach comes from him. So why all the dodgy I don't know if they use that word in America, but in Australia, where I was for 2 years, they use that word, dodgy. Why all this dodgy? Dodgy means like shady stuff. Why couldn't have we had a nice, clean lineage where everyone was righteous people and was marrying appropriate people? So the Zohar talks about this, interestingly enough, and it says something quite fascinating. In the Zohar, it says that the origin of Moshiach comes about through questionable means in order to keep the forces of evil from interfering with God's plan. And I'm reading to you. The holiness of Moshiach is so great that the forces of evil would do anything to prevent his soul from descending to this world. Therefore, God hid from them the moment of conception through cloaking it in a form that appeared less than holy. So it's an interesting idea that, he's like kind of smuggled into the country.
In other words, keep it human.
It's not the way I understood it, but I hear what you're saying. You're saying keep it human in the sense that he's just like one of us. I mean, nobody has a perfect lineage.
Or a perfect family.
Maybe I do understand what you're saying. In other words, there was nothing special about him. In which case we are understanding it in the same way. So that was God's way of hiding it, so to say. But I think more specifically, it wasn't just regular people, but it was actually things which are, so to say, on the surface forbidden. And it goes to speak to the greatness of the soul of Moshiach, which cannot come into the world through regular channels. Which, by the way, we find this concept in numerous places. For example, we find that Jacob received the blessing through using trickery. A blessing that, obviously looking back, belonged to Jacob. There's no question about it. That was the chosen one. That was part of Hashem's plan. But nevertheless, in order to receive it, he had to use some deception. It couldn't come to him through normal and straight measures. Another interesting example that I'll give you is, it's not exactly the same, but it's kind of related. In yesterday's Torah portion, we read the curses, the Torah portion of Bechukotai. And if you look inside, it's pretty harsh. It's pretty bad. Looks, if we don't do what we're supposed to, it's, God is really going to let us have it. And in the Pnimius HaTorah, in the inner teachings of the Torah, it talks about the fact that really we know no bad comes from Hashem. And it says in the Kabbalistic teachings that really all of the curses are actually blessings. Not only are they blessings, they are the greatest form of blessing. And the blessings are so great that they cannot come into this world via regular channels. And therefore, the way they are expressed in this world is actually in the form of a punishment and suffering. And you might be scratching your head saying, how does that make any sense? If it's a blessing, and if it's such a great blessing, then why would it come out as bad? And just to give you an example, the answer is, if there would be too much light, we wouldn't be able to see anything. We would actually experience darkness, right? If it's way too light, you can't see. Or if you have a teacher who gives, a beloved teacher who gives, who really wants to impart his wisdom in, the secrets of life to you, and he gives you everything, much more than you can understand, where you're going to experience is darkness. You're going to experience confusion. You're going to say, my teacher doesn't like me. The teacher is not really invested in me because he or she is telling me things which I can in no way comprehend. I can't understand it at all. Right? It's too difficult for me to understand. But in truth, they've just given you so much, which is too much for you to understand. So it's appearing like it's dark. So in a similar way, it's these great high things which come into the world, and they cannot they're too great to go through the regular system. God has a system in place where he gets, sustenance and livelihood, and he gets things into the world. But sometimes they're so great, they cannot come into the world through regular measures and regular ways. So that perhaps is one explanation, or one part of an explanation, as to why King David has such a shady past, and is and for the same price, the past of King David is pretty shady as well. All right, does anybody want to ask any questions before we continue on to some more things about King David? Make any comments, questions?
This is Leslie. Well, that leads us to believe that the coming Moshiach may have a shady past as well.
So the shady Moshiach already has a shady past, because part of his lineage is from King David. So
I mean shadier than that. Meaning we can't possibly know, but we could probably be surprised. We could probably be very surprised.
you never know.
Well, what I'm saying is,
I could tell you that Moshiach, the Rambam Maimonides, who gives us the halachic, and halachic means the Jewish law definition of who Moshiach is. From his writing, it's clear that Moshiach is not going to be some random dude who's one day going to wake up and be like, "Oh, I'm the Moshiach." Moshiach has to prove themselves. They have to be from the greatest scholars. They have to be exceptionally God-fearing. They have to be a tremendous influencer. And when I say that, I don't mean like, social media influencer, but they have to be like an influencer. They have to be a tremendous influence of Jewish people. They have to wage the wars of Hashem, etc., etc. So is it possible that there's going to be interesting things in his lineage? Yes, for sure, but not to be confused with, it's going to be some person that you'll never expect to be the Moshiach, then all of a sudden, kaboom, he's the Moshiach. From the Rambam, it doesn't seem like that. It would be a person who's, on the way to proving themselves to be the Moshiach.
the pattern that we see when we study King David, the pattern isn't it likely to be repeated in some way?
Perhaps.
I'm just saying this because I think it's important to keep an open mind. That's what I'm endeavoring to do anyway. That's all.
An open mind is always important, but as my older brother once told me, he said, "Don't be too open-minded because your brains might fall out."
It might fall out. I think mine already did.
We have in the comments, somebody asked 2 questions. Does the Talmud give any significance to David's red hair? Good question. I think so, but I can't think of anything right now. So I'll get back to that in a second. But to your second question, was King David a Benoni, or was he a Rasha based upon the sins of his marriage? So what you are referring to is that King David married Bathsheba, which we said before is the mother of King Solomon. So is King David considered a Rasha, which means an evil person? Like, to what degree do we hold him responsible for that sin? So you are going to be shocked by this answer, but King David is considered to be a completely righteous tzaddik, 100%. The Talmud tells us whoever claims that King David sinned by taking Bathsheba is mistaken. That is a statement from the Talmud. And in the Tanya, which is where we go to find the definition of the who's who, we quote a saying from King David numerous times that King David says, "V'libi chalal b'kirbi," which means my heart is hollow inside of me. And the Alter Rebbe says that King David did not have an evil inclination because he killed it through fasting. So King David is up there with the righteous people, incapable of doing bad. The fact that on the surface it looks like something bad is obviously true, but the fact that we see how much God agreed to what he did by the fact that King Solomon was the next king. King David had more than one son from more than one woman. Nevertheless, King Solomon himself who was the daughter of that marriage between him and Bathsheba, was chosen by Hashem to be the next king. Not only was he chosen by Hashem to be the next king, but we see, how much God agreed with King Solomon. King Solomon was given these tremendous gifts by Hashem. So to answer your question, at least your second question, although on the face value of what King David did with Bathsheba seems to be extremely questionable, King David is considered to be up there with the righteous tzaddikim. Speaking of which, the Talmud tells us an interesting story, and this one I prepared to show you. It says in the Talmud, it tells us the story of King David's passing. And I told you a couple of minutes ago that King David passed on Shabbos. On Shavuot. But the Talmud tells us the following story. It says that when it came time for King David to pass away, instead of me making it up, let me try to pull it up. Here you go. Here. So he's quoting from, the Talmud is quoting from the book of Psalms, which probably we'll talk about next week, and kind of interpreting different verses. So regarding one verse, Psalm 39:5, it says as follows. David said before the Holy One, blessed be he, before Hashem, Master of the universe, make me know my end. I want to know in how long I'm going to die. So God said to him, it is decreed before me that I do not reveal the end of life of flesh and blood. All right? Sorry, that's not something I could tell you. So he asked further, and the measure of my days, on what day of the year will I die? Said to him, it is decreed before me not to reveal the measure of a person's days. So again, he said, let me know how short-lived I am. On what day of the week will I die? So God wouldn't tell him how many years, wouldn't tell him what day of the month, but he would tell him what day of the week it's going to be. And he says, you're going to die on the first day of the week, on Shabbos, on Saturday. So David said, let me die on Sunday, so at least the honor of Shabbos will not be tarnished by the pain of death. He said to him, on that day, the time of the kingdom of your son Solomon has already arrived, and one kingdom does not overlap with another, even by a hairbreadth, which, by the way, really gives you, in Hashem's, everything is perfect and exact to Hashem. There's a certain amount of time of your kingdom, and boom, when that's over, it's over. Time for King Solomon. Even a hairbreadth, we cannot. He said to him, I will see the day of my life and die on Shabbos Eve. He said, no problem. Let me die on Friday. Didn't want to die on Shabbos. It's a holy, God said to him, for a day in your courts is better than 1,000. Right? The preciousness of one moment of one day of your life, you can't give it away. A single day in which you sit and engage in Torah is preferable to me than 1,000 burnt offerings that your son Solomon will offer before me on the altar. By the way, I want to interject over here. King David begged Hashem to be able to build the Beit HaMikdash, to be able to build the temple. So when the Jewish people entered into the land of Israel, they had with them the Mishkan, the tabernacle that had been built by Moses in the desert. But it wasn't a permanent structure. Although for hundreds of years, 300 or 400 years, it was in one location. It wasn't moving around. It was in the city of Shiloh. And they did add to some degree to it, but everyone knew that there was a mitzvah to build a Beit HaMikdash, to build a temple, and King David really wanted that. He was the one that, he created Jerusalem as the capital city, etc. And God told him that you cannot be the one to build a temple. Who knows why?
Because he was a warrior.
That's right. God told him, because you have blood on your hands, which means you were a warrior. You went to many wars. King David fought many, many wars, which is really how he created the security and this peace in the land of Israel. And God said, it's not appropriate that you, who fought so many wars, should build the temple, which is a place of peace. And nevertheless, God allowed him to create the plans And eventually King Solomon, his son, was the one who built the temple, which, by the way, King Solomon never went to war a day in his life. There was no wars. The Jewish people never fought any wars under King Solomon, which really the reason for that is because of what King David did. So you can see in kind of the conversation between Hashem and King David that it bothered him, the fact that he was not able to bring sacrifice in the temple. So God says to him, a single day in which you study and engage in Torah study is preferable to me than 1,000 burnt offerings. So what happened? What did David do? Every Shabbos, he would sit and learn all day to protect himself from the angel of death. Because we know, and we see from other stories recorded in the Talmud, that the angel of death cannot take a person when they're studying Torah. There's other stories that are mentioned over there as well. So every Shabbos, he would sit and learn Torah all day to protect himself from the angel of death. On that day in which the angel of death was supposed to put his soul to rest, the day in which David was supposed to die, the angel of death came, and he was unable to overcome David because his mouth did not pause from study. He was studying Torah the whole time. So the angel of death said, what shall I do? So what happened was David had a garden, a bustana, behind his house. The angel of death came, climbed, and shook the trees really loud. Like a tornado, right? Like a tornado and a hailstorm in Texas, one of those. So David went out to sea, and obviously he temporarily stopped studying Torah. As he climbed the stair broke beneath him. He was startled. Oh, sorry, that didn't even stop him. But when he went out to sea, he climbed the stairs, and the stair underneath him broke. He was startled and he was silent. He interrupted his studies for a moment, and he passed. So, a little insight into that story really shows obviously the greatness of King David. King David was a tremendous Torah scholar, was always studying. The admiration or the love, if you will, that God had for him. God tells him, one day of your Torah study is more precious to me than 1,000 sacrifices. And we know how important sacrifices are. So just to finish up, the life, in 5 short steps, we basically have King David as a youngster, which his primary occupation was a shepherd. As we spoke earlier, he was not loved by his family. And interestingly enough, we know that this occupation of shepherd runs very deep into Jewish leadership. Moses, of course, was a shepherd. And Jacob was a shepherd. I mean, everyone was a shepherd. And here we see King David being a shepherd. That was really preparing him for his role of king, his role of leadership. Eventually, he was anointed king during the lifetime of King Saul. And at that point, created this tremendous rift between King Saul and King David. Much of what King David writes about himself and a lot of his life stories about this interaction that takes place. You're all familiar with the story of Goliath, with Goliath, King David destroying Goliath, after which he married King Saul's daughter, and he was best friends with King Saul's son. His name was Jehonasson, Jonathan, but King Saul himself did not like King David and wanted to kill him. So he spent a lot of time on the run, and that has much to do with his life story. Eventually, King Saul is killed in battle. King David is terribly distraught as a result of that, furious at anyone that will do anything in any shape or form to slight King Saul, which speaks to the greatness of King David, because King Saul wanted to kill him for so many years, but nevertheless, he treats King Saul with this tremendous amount of respect. Eventually, he's proclaimed king by all the Jewish people, which was unique because that didn't last very long. Already, after the times of King Solomon, we already had a split in the Jewish kingdom. So all of the Jews, the stories described in the prophets, come and appoint and anoint and declare King David as the king, he originally sets up his home, his capital city, actually in the city of Hebron, and eventually he moves to Jerusalem, which is called Ir David, right, the city of David, and he builds up Jerusalem, and he prepares the plans for the temple. So we're going to stop here. I will take maybe a few questions or some conversations, but just maybe I'm throwing kind of random facts at you from King David. So I wanted to just kind of sum it up, you know, the interesting life story that he has as being born and who he is as a child, becomes the king at a very young age, even though there's another king as well. So he's just kind of waiting. He's this mighty warrior, phenomenal army man, you know, if you will. He's just a phenomenal general and a leader, has this mighty army. Eventually he becomes king. He's accepted as king by all the Jewish people, sets up in Hebron, sets up in Jerusalem, and really creates a Israel of messianic, I don't know what the word is, but of messianic, you know, level status, where the Jewish people are safe. They have plans to build a temple. Jews are getting along. There's a king, there's a prophet, and there's capability to be able to just sit and serve Hashem and not be troubled by all the troubles of this world. So that's, we'll stop here for the end of part 1. And next week we'll talk about many other things that are connected to King David's life.